for the collection. And so this sermon kind of comes at a strange time because normally we break out in a song. And I always think of the Israelites when they crossed the Red Sea, and when they were separated from their enemies, they reached the other side, and the first thing they did was they broke out in song. And I love that part of the Lord's Supper where we have that opportunity, that solemn memorial of Jesus Christ, and then we get to follow that by breaking out in song, just like those Jews did when they escaped Egypt. But for now, I want to hit pause on the service, because this morning we're talking about the resurrection, and really what better time to discuss the resurrection than right after the Lord's Supper. That supper that we take that is about his death and the sacrifice that he made. Let's hit pause and now focus on what really makes that resurrection mean something, which is the fact that, the fact that he died means something, which is the fact that he rose from the dead. That's really what gives this supper significance. If Jesus doesn't rise from the dead, this memorial that we take really doesn't mean a thing at all, no matter how serious we take it, no matter how solemn we make it. And so that's what I want to talk to you about this morning, are 5 facts that revolve around the resurrection, and subtitle being Following the Evidence. And I want to start by asking this question: has anyone ever raised a question or an objection to your faith that you found challenging? That in the moment you had no idea how to answer it? Maybe it was a question like, hey, I got asked this one recently, like, what's my view on dinosaurs, right? Dinosaurs, and did they exist with man? What does the Bible say about dinosaurs? That's a good question. What about the age of the earth? You ever been asked a question about that? You're a Christian and somebody comes up to you and says, okay, you're a Christian, so what do you believe about the age of the earth? Or evolution? Or what about how did Noah get all of those animals into the ark? How exactly does that work? And I think this group is going to go to Kentucky and see the ark, and they'll see just how massive it is and see that is doable. Or how about this one? This is a really tough question. Somebody says, if God is real, why does he allow evil to exist? Why is it that bad things have happened to me? Why is it that I have lost loved ones if God is real? Those are tough questions to handle. And we've all been in that situation where, your palms get kind of sweaty and your heart starts pounding, and one of the worst things we can do is answer off the cuff and give an answer that isn't a very good answer. I find that a lot of times when I was growing up, I would be spinning my wheels and trying to convert people by talking about specific doctrinal points. I would maybe talk about views on instrumental music, or even views on baptism for the remission of sins. But it suddenly dawned on me when I came across a book that goes over these things that the place we must start, or else nothing else really matters, is the resurrection. Because listen, if Jesus rose from the dead, and I believe that, and I'm convinced of that, it becomes a whole lot easier to have faith in the other things that he said. It becomes a whole lot easier to have faith in the scriptures, the things that Jesus himself testifies to and says, they testify about me. I take the Bible more seriously, knowing that this guy who was risen from the dead points to the scriptures and says, follow it. You see, the resurrection is almost like the first domino to fall, and after that, everything is easy. One of my least favorite kinds of people in the world, you ever play the game Jenga? And I don't like the person that you start off and immediately they go for the bottom piece, right? And then they make it so that you got this Jenga stack, and then they grab the other piece, and the whole thing is sitting on one piece. They just start the game like that. What kind of insanity is that? That's crazy to me. But if we don't have this firm understanding of the resurrection, our faith is kind of like that. We start off and we're already teetering. We're on the verge of falling over right from the jump, and that's why it's so important for us to be firm in this. This is our foundation, and everything else builds off of it. And if you don't believe me, take it from the words of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 4. It's kind of interesting when you look at this text A lot of scholars say that this is actually an oral tradition, something that was started about 2 or 3 years after Jesus rose from the dead. And you can tell because there's cadences in there, there's a certain rhythm, and scholars pretty much accept that this was something that was handed down by tradition so that they could memorize the gospel. And so Paul, he repeats that to them and says, I received this, I delivered it to you. But he says this in verse 1, I want to make clear for you, brothers and sisters, the gospel I preached to you, which you received, on which you have taken your stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold to the message I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I passed on to you as most important. That's what he says. He says, this thing that I'm talking about is of most importance, and what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And so there you have it, an inspired apostle telling us that this is the most important thing that you start with. This is where it all begins, and this is where everything builds off of. And so when you look at what we're talking about this morning, this isn't really a sermon. I have a lot of information in here, a lot of quotes, very little of my own thoughts or words. And so what I've done is I've compiled a series of 5 facts that I got from this book, along with their quotes, and I just want to take you through them. And what you're going to find is that these facts, if you just take one of them on their own, they're not that significant. That's true of any investigation that you go into. If you are a crime scene investigator and you're trying to prosecute a person and you think that they committed the crime, it's one thing if you know that they were in the area on the same day when this person got murdered. That's one thing, but that's not enough to get a conviction. So were 100 other people. It's another thing if you know they're in the same area on the same day, around the same time, and they had a personal relationship with the victim. You see how the case becomes stronger. If you just take one of those facts, it's not enough, but you put them all together, and all of a sudden you got a really strong case to convict this person and convince a jury that they did it. The resurrection is just like anything else. It's like this divine crime scene where human beings murdered God's Son. And if that took place in space and time in history, then we're going to see traces of that. There's going to be evidence left over that point to the realization that this is fact. This is something that happened. We can believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, and it can be reasonable. And so I preach this lesson for those people who are looking to maybe have a firmer faith. But then maybe you're here this morning and you're thinking, man, Christianity is stupid. And your friends drug you here, or you drug yourself here, or your parents drug you here, or whatever it may be. If you leave and you get nothing else from this sermon except one thing, and that's this, that we have a logical reason to believe that Jesus is the Christ. That it's logical to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And you don't have to come to that same conclusion, but I hope that you see these things and you realize that this is in fact reasonable to believe such things. And so let's just start off this morning. Fact number 1, before you can prove that somebody rose from the dead, you have to first prove that Jesus in fact died. I'll never forget when I was growing up and I took a college class. It was the first college class I ever took. It was on world history. I didn't get my college degree, so it tells you how that went. But I remember it was world history, and the topic of Christianity came up in the context of this. And I remember this question popped in my brain, and I wanted to ask the professor whether or not it was a historical fact and accepted by historians that Jesus, at the very least, existed. And you know what? I didn't raise my hand, because at the time I thought that was a stupid question. I thought that people would look at me and laugh at me for that, because you have to have faith just to believe that he even existed. And what you find when you look at history is that that's not the case. So there's kind of 2 facts in one on this one. Because when you have people who aren't Christians, who existed around the same time as Christ, testifying to the fact that Jesus died, guess what else that proves? Proves that he existed, doesn't it? And so you have a quote by Josephus. Many of us are familiar with him. He was not a Christian. For a long time, he was a Pharisee, and he actually became like this Roman sympathizer, and I think that Jews began to not like him so much. But he became this historian, and he kept a record of a lot of things that happened in Judea and Jerusalem around that time. And listen how specific this is. That when we read about the crucifixion of Jesus and the names that were involved, the first thing that Josephus mentions is Pilate. The same thing, the same person that our Gospels mention. It says, Pilate, upon hearing him accused by men, that's Jesus, of the highest standing amongst us, had condemned him to be crucified. Those who had in the first place come to love him did not give up their affection for him. So that's Josephus talking about Pilate sentencing Jesus to be put to death. You have another man named Tacitus, who was also a Roman historian. In other places, he talks about how Christianity was an abomination. This guy was a pagan. He hated Christians, and he was just fine with the things that Nero decided to do to the Christians. He says, when describing them, he says, their name comes from Christ, who during the reign of Tiberius had been executed by the procurator Pontius Pilate. So there's another source, and he lived 56 to 118 AD. And then you have this other guy named Lucian of Samosata. So these are just 3 quotes that I decided to include. There's others that I left out for sake of time. But this guy's a satirist, and a Greek satirist, and in 125 to 180 AD, around, that was his lifespan. But sometime during that time, he wrote this, and this is a guy that wasn't a Christian, made fun of Christianity, disdained Christianity. He also writes of Christians. This is less than 100 years later, give or take. He says, the Christians you know worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. So I want you to notice in all 3 of these cases, nobody's debating whether or not Jesus existed. It was a foregone conclusion. It was an accepted fact that everybody knew back then. And they certainly aren't even questioning whether or not he was crucified or put to death. It was just an accepted fact. And so I have one atheist modern day scholar who is a New Testament scholar. Why you would be an atheist instead of study the New Testament, I don't know. But he says that he, Jesus, was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be. That's quite a statement. He's saying it's as sure as any other historical fact that Jesus was crucified. And so our first piece of evidence, our first fact that we look at, is the fact that Jesus did in fact die and he was crucified. And of course, the story doesn't end there. The apostles go on and they preach that not only did Jesus die, but they claim that he arose from the dead, and not only arose, but that Jesus, in fact, appeared to them. And so Paul actually talks about this in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 9 through 11. He goes on there, and he's talking about how he's the least of the apostles, not worthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But he says, by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace towards me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, yet not I, but the grace of God that was with me. But he says, whether then it is I or they, now this is in the context of him describing the gospel, whether it was I, the apostle Paul, or they, other apostles, he says, we proclaim, and so you have believed. And so Paul is saying, I'm not the only one that has proclaimed this. That you know guys like Peter. And he also proclaimed the same exact thing that I am proclaiming to you. And so when we talk about establishing this fact, we're not even trying to establish it as a fact that this actually happened. The only thing we're trying to establish is that the disciples believed it. At the very least, they believed it. They weren't lying. They believed this. And so Paul is saying, first of all, that they claimed it. You go on, and this was also the case outside of the Bible where the apostles were known to have proclaimed these types of things. So you have a church father named Clement of Rome, and he's possibly mentioned in Philippians 4 and verse 3. But he goes on to say that having received orders and complete certainty caused by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ and believing in the Word of God, they went with the Holy Spirit's certainty, preaching the good news that the kingdom of God is about to come. And so what he's saying, and this is a guy who was probably conversant with the apostles, had a personal relationship with them. He's writing this letter to the Christians in Corinth, and it's talking about how the apostles went out with complete certainty in Jesus. And it was all caused by the resurrection of our Lord Jesus. He's saying this is something they claimed. You have another guy named Polycarp. Again, some of you are familiar with these names, others aren't. Polycarp historically was somebody that was a student of the Apostle John. So notice he lived about 66 to 150 AD. This isn't long after Jesus ascended. And so he was a contemporary of the Apostle John, had a relationship with him, was friends with him, was trained by him. But he talks about the apostles, and he says, they did not love this present age, but him who died for our benefit and for our sake was raised. And so these are quotes that aren't found in the Bible, but are found, they're secular quotes found outside of the Bible. You look at a guy named Tertullian, and he talks about Peter and Paul. He lived about 155 to 220 AD. This is interesting. He says, Paul is beheaded, has been written in their own blood. He said, and if a heretic wishes his confidence to rest upon public record, the archives of the empire will speak. And so understand what this guy is saying. He's saying, if you want to dispute whether or not Paul was in fact beheaded or Peter was crucified upside down, he's saying you can go and look at the Roman Empire archives and you can find a historical record of these things happening. That's the claim that he's making. Now, 2,000 years later, we don't have those. But it's significant that he's making that claim and is challenging people, go and check my work, go and check what I'm saying. He says, go check the archives of the empire and they will speak. He says, as with the stones of Jerusalem, he says, we read the lives of the Caesars. So this is the work that he's quoting. At Rome, Nero was the first who stained with blood the rising faith. Then is Peter girt by another when he is made fast to the cross. And so you look at this, not only did they claim it, but we recognize that there's historical data that shows and proves that they claimed it, but also were willing to die for it. Paul was beheaded, Peter was crucified, and many others of these apostles suffered horrible things. Why would they do that if they did not, in fact, believe these things? And so there's other quotes I could share with you, but I find some of these to be very convincing, modern-day scholars. This guy's named Gerd Ludermann, also an atheist New Testament scholar. He studied the data, he studied what all the sources say, and this is what he says, an atheist, not a Christian, an atheist. He says it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death. Now notice, he's not saying that their experiences were true or valid. We're not trying to prove that point. The only point he's making is that they did have experiences that were real at the very least to them. He says it's historically certain that they had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Okay, that's an atheist, not a Christian, okay? We go on, there's another, Paula Fredrickson, who was on the faculty at Boston University, was also a Christian scholar, but also a skeptic, not a believer. I wouldn't say she's an unbeliever either. But she says, I know in their own terms, what they saw was the raised Jesus. That's what they say. And then all the historic evidence we have afterwards attests to their conviction that that's what they saw. I'm not saying that they really did see the raised Jesus. I wasn't there. I don't know what they saw, but I do know that as a historian, they must have seen something. That's impressive. This is a New Testament scholar who knows a lot more than I do, and she's saying, at the very least, for these guys to have the transformation that they did, they must have seen something. So there's this guy, Gary Habermas, and all these quotes that I'm getting, they're really from a book that he co-wrote with a guy. But he's known as this leading expert on the resurrection, and he studied just pretty much everything there is to study in multiple different languages. And so he's actually studied 1,400 sources written on the resurrection since 1975. I haven't read 1,400 of anything, so that's pretty impressive. But he cataloged and studied 650 of those in English, German, and French. So he's reading things in different languages. And this was his conclusion. He says, perhaps no fact is more widely recognized than that the early Christian believers had real experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. A critic may claim that what they saw were hallucinations or visions, but he does not deny that they actually experienced something. And so you look at the lives these guys lived, everything that they suffered, and you can't explain it unless they actually had a genuine experience. And so the second fact is that the disciples actually believed that Jesus was risen and that he appeared to them. Fact number 3 is that Paul was converted. Paul is perhaps one of the most persuasive arguments to Christianity there has ever been. I mean, here you have a guy that was actively persecuting the church, and he actually talks about this openly in his letters to other Christians. He says, I'm the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. He says, you've heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it, he says to the Galatians. And he talks about how in his former days he was very zealous, and to prove that, he says, I was a persecutor of the church. In Acts 22 and verse 20, this is Luke taking an account of this in the book of Acts. Paul claims that when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving, watching over the garments of those who killed him. So this wasn't some obscure fact that Paul was a persecutor of the church. He participated in the stoning of Stephen. The Christians, when he became a Christian in Jerusalem, they were afraid of him. They weren't ready to accept him. Everybody knows that Paul was a fierce opponent of the faith. And so it's not that Paul was a skeptic. It's not that he's saying, well, I don't know about this. Paul had seen the evidence, he had heard the reports, and none of it was enough to convince him. He was a persecutor of the church. He was so certain that Christianity was false that he was willing to drag people off to prison and where they would eventually be put to death. And then all of a sudden, God has a sense of humor, doesn't he? Here you have this guy, Paul. He's on his way to Damascus. He's going there to arrest people and have them drug off to prison, it says. And by the time he gets to Damascus, he's the guy that's preaching the gospel. It says Saul grew stronger and kept confounding the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Messiah. So here you have a guy that goes from persecuting the church. Now all of a sudden he's being persecuted for the church by the very people that he used to belong to. How do you explain a change like that? How do you explain such a stark transformation? This would be like if I converted to Islam. What would it take for you to convert to Islam? You would have to have some sort of divine intervention to make that switch. I'm sure most of you would. That's a similar situation Paul was in. Here, from Paul's own words, is what he says changed him, what caused him to change course. He says, when Jesus was appearing to all these people, he says, last of all, as to one born at the wrong time, he also appeared to me. You see, he didn't hear some convincing argument that finally won him over. He didn't hear the apostles preaching about how they saw him that finally won him over. What Paul says is that Jesus appeared to me, and that's what won me over as I was on my way to Damascus. And so in Paul, you have somebody that goes from persecuting to being persecuted, and the only thing we can conclude is that he must have seen something. Fact number 4 is that James is converted. You remember James, he wrote the book, the epistle of James. He's the brother of the Lord, and we see that in the Gospels. But in John 7 and verse 5, he's just forthright about it, that his brothers are talking to Jesus, and that would include James, right? And so John writes, not even his brothers believed him, right? Here's James, and his own brother, right, is the Lord. And he knew him, he was raised with him, and he wasn't convinced initially that Jesus was Lord. And so he was so unconvinced that actually when his family heard Jesus preaching, and again, James would be involved in this, they tried to restrain him, and they said, he's out of his mind. Again, James isn't just a skeptic at this point. He's trying to save Jesus from himself. He thought his brother was insane for saying the things that he did. And then all of a sudden we read about James, being a leader in the church. You read Acts 15, and they're having this council in Jerusalem deciding what they should bind on the Gentiles. And who is it that finally speaks up and says, this is what we're going to do? It's James, the brother of Jesus. How does he go from thinking his brother is crazy to now all of a sudden being the leader in the first century church where people are looking at him for answers? How do you go from that to that? He must have seen something. We have historical evidence that this was the case as well. Josephus talks about the high priest Ananus, how he assembled the judges and brought them the brother of Jesus who is called Christ. He said his name was James, and some others as well. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So James wasn't just a convert. He, historically, according to Josephus, is eventually stoned for believing that his brother is the Christ. What happened? What caused that dramatic transformation? Again, Paul tells us. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. In the high school class, I've gone over some of these things, and I think the thing that really got them was I asked them, what would it take for you to believe that your cousin or your brother is the Christ and to begin worshiping him? And all of a sudden their eyes light up, and they understand how dramatic of a transformation this is. I don't care what stories are being told about my siblings. I don't care what legends are developing about my brothers. There is no chance that all of a sudden I'm getting down on my knees and I'm worshiping one of my older brothers. It's just not going to happen. And yet that's what James does. He worships somebody that for most of his life he knew as being his older brother. How do you have such a dramatic transformation like that? According to Paul, he says that it was the case that Jesus appeared to James, and that was the thing that convinced him. It's often said that people who lived, and this is why these are important, it's often said that people who lived back then were gullible. You ever hear that? That in those days, they were prone to believe such things because they believed in miracles. They were more superstitious than we are, and they were just inclined. They wanted to believe this. Do you think Paul wanted to believe this? Do you think James comes across as somebody who's gullible? When you think about it, the Jewish people were really the last people you would expect to worship a man, period, right? They believed that there was one God and one God only. We believe that too, but what they didn't understand is that Jesus manifested himself as God in the flesh. You go to a Greek society, and they would be the ones that would be inclined to listen to a message like that. But when you look at Paul and you look at James, these guys were skeptics. Paul was an opposer of the faith, and yet somehow they end up being converted to Christianity. They must have seen something. And so the last fact is that the tomb was empty. And I'll be honest with you, this one is, the others have a virtual consensus among scholars, the first four do. This one's more like 75% of scholars agree with this. And actually it's the one that I'm most certain of. And I would suggest to you the reason why more scholars don't come out and say that it's historical fact that the tomb was empty is because there are huge implications if that tomb is empty. It's really hard to wiggle out of the obvious conclusion if that tomb, historical fact, was empty. And so there's a couple of things that I think lend itself to us believing the tomb was empty that stand out to me. The first one is the Jerusalem factor. The fact that these things were said to have taken place in Jerusalem and were also proclaimed for the first time in Jerusalem. And so I always like to pick on somebody whenever I'm making this point, and so I don't know, I'll pick on Andy since he can pick on me next week when I'm not here. But you can imagine if I was trying to convince somebody that my friend Andy, he can jump from the free throw line on a basketball court and dunk the basketball. If I was trying to convince people of that, would I start by preaching that message here? How many of you are convinced that Andy can take off from the free throw line of a basketball court and can dunk it? Maybe Ava. Andy's jumping in the background like that with Ava. Yeah, you're not going to buy that. You know Andy. You know what he's capable of. You know that he can't take off from the free throw line and dunk a basketball. Now, if I go to Washington State where nobody knows him and I start telling people that I saw my friend Andy do this, they have no reason to not believe me. That's not what happened with the Gospels. The Gospels, it's not like they said, let's start in a faraway country and see if we can convince people of this. No, they began to preach it in the very place where those events were said to have taken place. And so no less than 50 days after Jesus is ascended up into heaven, it says, Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice. He proclaims the first gospel sermon ever preached. It says, fellow Jews and all you residents of Jerusalem, let this be known to you and pay attention to my words. And he goes on and preaches a sermon about Jesus of Nazareth. It would be so easy. What are they? Maybe a few miles tops, if that, from where Jesus was buried. It would be so easy to falsify what Peter proclaims if it isn't true. And yet Peter has no problem boldly proclaiming this message. It took place and was first proclaimed in Jerusalem. But the one that really gets me is enemy attestation. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, my grandma, she always had good things to say about me, and naturally, right? There's nothing bad to say here, right? And so she would tell people that I was perfect, and that I never made any mistakes, and that I was flawless. And so if I'm trying to get a job and convince somebody that I am an employable person, how influential is it going to be on the employer if I give my Grammy as a reference? And she'll tell you how wonderful I am and how I'm a good kid. I've never gotten into any trouble. Yeah, you're not going to take that serious, are you? But if you go out and you find my worst enemy, and they might have all sorts of bad things to say about me, but when it comes down to it, my worst enemy says, but you know what? Sam is a really good guy. Are you going to take that a little bit more serious? I would. That's probably not what my worst enemy would say, but I'm saying if that did happen, I would take it serious. Well, that's what you have with the empty tomb. You not only have Jesus' disciples claiming it was empty, you have his enemies indirectly attesting to the fact that it was empty. And this was after Jesus was risen. They find the empty tomb, his enemies do. It says the priests had assembled with the elders and agreed on a plan. They said, okay, we've got to come up with a plan to stop this movement. So here was their plan. It wasn't to say, no, we actually have the body. That's not what the plan was. It wasn't to say, you know what, they thought the tomb was empty, but they found the wrong tomb. We have the right one that actually has his body. That wasn't what they did. It says they gave the soldiers a large sum of money and told them, say this, his disciples came during the night and stole him while we were sleeping. They just confessed something, didn't they? Why do they have to tell people that the disciples stole the body? Because they didn't have a body. And they knew as well as anybody that if you go into that tomb where Jesus was buried, the body is no longer there. And they had to come up with a reason as to why that was the case. This isn't the disciples. This is Jesus' own enemies indirectly attesting to the fact that the tomb was empty. So I know this is a lot of information. But let's just put this all together really quick and let's just follow the evidence. The facts are that Jesus was killed. And the facts are also that the disciples believed he rose from the dead. We also know that Paul, who opposed the faith, was converted. We also know that James, the brother of Jesus and former skeptic, was also converted. And we have a pretty good feeling that the tomb was empty. Now, no matter what you do today, you have to wrestle with these facts. You either have to prove that they aren't facts, or you have to come up with a way to best explain the data that we have. You owe that to yourself. My wife and I, we went to Australia for our honeymoon. We had the opportunity to do that. And I don't know if you realize this, but Australia is like, there's not really many Christians that way. And it's interesting because you feel like you're in America when you're there. But there's people that just don't really have a faith. And I asked one of the members at the church there, why she thinks that's the case, why virtually no Australians really believe. And she said, I think it's because nobody has really just given the time to actually think about it. To ask themselves, is there a God? To ask themselves, could it be that Jesus is Lord? They've never stopped to ask themselves the questions. And this is, I would suggest, the most important question you could ask. Is Jesus Lord? Because it's the most common, widely accepted faith that exists to this day. Majority of the world's population claim to be Christians. The most famous person who has ever existed was Jesus. The most bold claim that anyone has made is that they rose from the dead. You're not going to wrestle with that? You're not going to at least try and come to some sort of conclusion of whether or not this is true or false? What's going to happen when you wake up after you die and you're standing before God? What are we going to say? I didn't have time? I didn't have the information and the age of information? You didn't give me what I needed to know? We owe it to ourselves to wrestle with the data that we have. And some people have attempted to. They say, you know what, it's a legend. Does that best explain the data? Again, is James going to be convinced to worship his brother because of a legend? Is Paul going to be convinced by a legend? And furthermore, legends don't just happen overnight. These are guys that were converted who were contemporaries who lived and walked with Jesus and his disciples. And furthermore, his own disciples who did walk with him, they were willing to die for these claims. And so that's not really a viable explanation in my mind. What about a fraud? The enemies say that the disciples stole the body, and maybe some would say that the disciples lied about it. But how many of us are willing to die for a lie? The disciples didn't really die when they go to the stake, when Paul's head is cut off, when Peter's crucified. Do we realize that they didn't die for something they had faith in? I mean, that's part of it, but that's not really what it boils down to. They're dying for a claim. They died claiming that he appeared to me. Not that somebody told me he rose, but that he appeared to me. And not one of them walks away from the opportunity to be martyred, if you call it an opportunity. Not one of them shy away from that. We have to explain that. Is that really a good explanation that all these guys are willing to die for a fraud? Wrong tomb. Whoopsies, right? Furthermore, when you look at the text, it says that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. This was a well-known tomb where you had 2 guards, Roman centurions, that were stationed by it to protect it. And additionally with that, Paul wasn't converted by an empty tomb. James wasn't converted by an empty tomb. The disciples didn't believe Jesus arose because the tomb was empty. They believed it because they saw him and claimed to have seen him appear to them firsthand. Some say he didn't actually die. Really, so he was whipped in the back. He was beaten in the face. He was given a crown of thorns. He was hung on a cross, where they say typically you die not from bleeding out, but because you can't lift yourself up anymore, you suffocate because your arms cause you to not be able to breathe. They stab him in the side, and blood and water comes out. You have some of the people that followed him. They remove him from the cross. They wrap him in linen clothes. They embalm his body with perfume and oil. They place him in a tomb. 3 days later, apparently this guy who's been stabbed in the side was beaten in the back with whips and was bleeding profusely, had a crown of thorns, sat on the cross for 6 hours. Apparently he just rolled that stone away. And then he shows up to the disciples, walks to Galilee. And they look at him, and they're not horrified by what they see, but somehow they look at this guy who's been maimed, stabbed, beaten, and say, oh, he's Lord. The text doesn't say that Jesus winced when Thomas touched the wounds. They saw a body, and it was a glorified body, a body that caused them to have great hope and to bow down and worship him and say that he is Lord. Are any of these the best explanations of the facts? There's others. My favorite one is the twin theory, that Jesus had a twin. You think James might recognize something there. My wife is a twin. I certainly can recognize the difference between her and her sister, fortunately. Maybe it's one of these things. You got to wrestle with that. Maybe he actually rose from the dead. Maybe he actually rose from the dead. Maybe he's actually Lord. And so I challenge you, if you have doubts, if you don't believe, if you think Christianity is stupid, that's fine, but you have to give an explanation for why these facts exist. What is more logical to believe? One of these ones on the right or the one on the left? If he is Lord, if he was raised, then he's Lord. And this is what we're really left with, is this decision to make. Paul says that for this reason, since Jesus was obedient to the point of death, he says, for this reason, God highly exalted him and gave Jesus the name that is above every name. So that the name of Jesus, every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. If Jesus rose from the dead, it doesn't matter what you believe. It doesn't make any difference as to whether or not these things actually happen. If they happen, he's king. And the decision that we have to make is, am I going to decide that he is king in this earth or in this life while my sins can be forgiven? Or am I going to wait until it's made obvious that he's king? That day when Jesus comes back, or when I pass on and I'm standing before him and I have no choice but to bow and confess that Jesus is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And so we hit pause on the worship this morning. We started the sermon really taking the Lord's Supper. And so if you're somebody that's been convinced by any of these things, and maybe this is all just going over your head, but if you need these quotes or you want access to that information, just please come to me and I can give you access to that. But if you're convinced by these things, and you realize there's no time to wait. Now's the time. We're on borrowed time, aren't we? Anything can happen. We could leave these doors and maybe not make it home. Now's the time to respond. And I hope that you join us as we stand and sing, and as we confess and we sing and we proclaim that Jesus Christ arose. Let's stand and sing this song.